Hello there. In this video, I'm going to teach you how to perform the preparation for the Pilates breaststroke, which is often referred to as the breaststroke prep. Now, the classical Pilates breaststroke, or indeed one of the modified versions, it's actually a very demanding exercise. You start lying on your front, the torso lifts up in this kind of dorsal raised position, and then the arms mimic a breaststroke pattern while you're on the mat. As a result, it can put a lot of strain in the low back, as that low back will tend to arch. And if you've got any acute spinal injuries or spinal pathologies in place, this is probably not an exercise you want to go anywhere near, because if you do arch that back and you're not in control of what's going on down there and you're not conditioned for that sort of exercise, you can put enormous strain there and then risk either new or further injury. So the preparation for the breaststroke takes it back to a much more refined level and begins the process of that step-by-step process where you might end up getting to the more advanced levels. It focuses on how to control your shoulders, how to lift your torso off the floor in a more efficient and, I would argue, safe way, particularly those of you who have potential problems in the low back. It's also a great exercise for re-educating better control of your scapula, your shoulder blades, and synergistically will stretch some of the muscles which get very tight on the front of the chest, particularly things like the pectoralis minor, which attach to the coracoid process of the shoulder blade, and therefore work in direct opposition to some of those shoulder retractors and setting muscles, which can become quite problematic for a lot of people these days. All of that will make more sense when we get down into the tutorial in a moment. As I said, it's going to be performed lying on your front, and so some of you may need pillows underneath your low stomach or underneath your head. I'll talk through that again when we're down on the mat. But now we'll get on with the tutorial for the breaststroke prep. Now, before we get into the specifics of the tutorial, the start position will be lying on your front with your arms by your side, palms facing the ceiling. Now, that position in itself can be problematic for some people, so there's lots of things which should be entertained before starting to get yourself comfortable. First up is what's going on underneath your head. A little cushion, towel, folded over, pillow or something like that can be, first of all, nice in terms of just alleviating any pressure on the front of the head, but also it can take pressure off the front of the chest if that's necessary. Some people will need a much more substantial head cushion, and that's certainly something to try to see whether it feels comfortable through the neck and through the front of the chest. Now, although when you're down in a fully prone position, you should be thinking about that neutral lumbar-pelvic position and then drawing that belt line area away from the floor slightly. You don't want to be over-exaggerating that. You don't want to be forcefully tucking your tailbone between your legs as you tilt that pelvis backwards. But similarly, you don't want to be really arched and burying that stomach into the floor. So you need to find that happy medium between the two. If that start position is uncomfortable, then again, some sort of cushioning or pillow can be very, very helpful. And placing that underneath that belt line area can be the difference between making it an efficient exercise and one which becomes quite uncomfortable. So certainly for some of my clients who have suffered with low back pain or don't want to arch their back at all, getting that pillow underneath is a bit of a no-brainer. Anyway, into our start position. Now, for the first aspect of the breaststroke prep, we're just going to focus on what's going on with the shoulder blades. So our arms, our wrists, and our head will stay anchored to the floor. From the start position, as I said, you draw that lower belt line area up towards the ceiling slightly, but there shouldn't be any discernible shift or forceful movement of your spine or pelvis. From that start position, take a breath in, and as you breathe out, float your shoulder blades simultaneously up towards the ceiling and down towards your tailbone. You then inhale to lower back down. It's a combination movement, so we're floating both up and down towards your tailbone in one smooth pattern.
when you get to the secondary element of that, the reaching towards your toes, towards your tailbone with the shoulder blades, you can actively stretch those fingers down towards the floor, but we don't want to lift the hands just yet. So this first level is a very simple one, but it sets the shoulders into that combination pattern of retraction, which in this instance is moving away from the ceiling, moving away from the floor towards the ceiling, and depression, moving away from the head towards the tailbone. So that combination movement of retraction and depression happens in a smooth arc. Be careful not to roll the shoulders up towards the ears first and then stretch. We're coming up and towards that tailbone in that smooth combination arc.
Now, of course, that is a very simple pattern, but it's important that we get used to the shoulder set and the correct position of the shoulder position there before we move on to the secondary and tertiary levels. Now, that will give a nice stretch to the front of the chest, and then we're ready for the second part of the sequence.
This time, we'll begin by floating those shoulders to their set position, and then from there, we just lift both hands at the same time, just a couple of inches from the floor. We can then lower everything back down together. Now, when you're starting out on this sequence, I would always relax all the way down back to your start position. Set those shoulders first, and then bring the arms up. Now, if you can see where my thumb is on the camera side, it's touching the side of my thigh, and I'm doing that because I don't want the hands coming up higher than the level of my shoulders. That shoulder set, and then the lift, is the second part of our breaststroke prep. Now, once you've got the hang of that, we can make it a combination movement where the shoulders set and the hands move as one. But what you need to be careful of is that you don't lead the movement with the hands first and then think, oh yeah, the shoulders need to be there as well. Shoulder arcing, hand lift, both hands at the same time, and then lowering back down.
Again, a relatively simple pattern which most people won't find challenging, but even with that, make sure that the lift of the shoulders and the lift of the hands, and particularly the lowering of both, happens in a nice symmetrical pattern. When you're in that position, we're now well versed in what's going on with the shoulders and how they control the arm movements, and we can add in the final element of the breaststroke prep, which is the head and chest lifting from the floor. To begin, make sure those core muscles are engaged and you're drawing that belt line away from the floor. We set the shoulders, float the hands, and from here, the breastbone and the front of the head lift slightly together. And then everything comes back down as one. Showing you again, we set the shoulders and hands, and then the breastbone and the head lift at the same time. Now, once we're up in that lift position, there is obviously extra work being done by the extensor muscles running along the back of the body. And that's where some of the potential problems can come in. Often, if you're not strong enough in that regard, your low back will arch significantly as those muscles try and take over, and that can lead to compression and discomfort. And then the very, very common mistake, which I see a lot of, is because of weakness in those muscles, the shoulders set, the hands set, and then the head does that movement. And we get all of that unwanted arching and overextension in the cervical spine, in the neck. That's definitely something to avoid, because not only does it give you a full sense of movement, but it promotes unwanted movement disorders and problems in that back of the neck area. So once you're in that third phase of the movement, not only do you want to be making sure you're not collapsing the stomach into the floor, but you want to be making sure that you're keeping that neck in a beautifully neutral position and not trying to lift too high into that extension pattern. Because there's already a number of things which can be going wrong at this stage, remember that less is often more. So when it comes to that third phase, which is often where people meet that little stumbling block, Make sure there's no discomfort in the back as you're performing it, and that you're working hard to keep the belt line and the rib cage pulled together and those deep abdominal muscles lifted from the floor, but also that you're not trying to overlift. So again, that less is more. We float up, and if it's just an inch or so that you're coming off the mat, then that's absolutely fine. If you're able to extend further towards the ceiling and maintain that neutral position, and you don't feel that stomach bearing down into the mat, then that's fine for you. One more time, we float up, and then back down. Exhaling as we perform our breaststroke prep, inhaling as we come back down, and you can see now it's a much smoother pattern where all three elements are being performed simultaneously. We've got the shoulder setting and hand lifting combined with our dorsal lift, our dorsal raise, and that's a nice smooth, slow, intentional pattern without feeling any unwanted compression or discomfort in the base of the spine. So there we have the breaststroke prep. There are some nice modifications you can do with that, some very simple ones, and I'll talk through those in just a moment, but hopefully that's given you a good understanding of that three-part process: the shoulder setting, the addition of the arms, and then the dorsal raise aspect coming in at the end. Okay, into some modifications for the breaststroke prep. Now, there might be a number of reasons you want to bring these in, whether it's just variation in exercise or whether it's trying to build at one level and wanting to improve endurance and control at that level before moving on to the next one. So the first thing which I would often recommend is the addition of a hundreds pattern, a little pulsing pattern before the head comes off the floor.
So it may be that you find the shoulder setting and the hand lift
Quite unchallenging in some ways, but the moment you try and bring that torso off the floor, it might just be beyond you, or you can't do too many repetitions. So for that reason,
we can really work on some of the endurance of our shoulder setting muscles by coming up into that almost like phase 2 position and then beginning some little hundreds pulses. Now here the temptation is immediately for the shoulders to drop back down to the floor and to go into that extended position for our shoulder joint, which is really unhelpful. So the challenge with this hundreds variation is to set the shoulders and then keep them set. So you're thinking about that shoulder setting position all the time. Now something which can be quite helpful in that regard is actually visualizing what's going on with your shoulder blades. So the shoulder blades are essentially upturned triangles, and the bottom angle of those triangles draws back and down in that combination of retraction and depression of the shoulder blades. And then if you visualize that bottom angle coming in together, then holding that there, feeling that height and that stretch over the collarbone region through those chest muscles while you're performing those little arm pulses, that will hopefully help you keep that ideal set shoulder position while you're focusing on the hundreds pattern. Keep the arms nice and straight if you're doing your hundreds pulsing. We don't want big swinging movements here, just little pulses, or you can draw circles in the air, whichever feels more natural to you. We can do the hundreds as well with the final step of that breaststroke prep as well. So if you're comfortable maintaining, holding that dorsal raised position, remember chin tucked in so you're nice and neutral through that cervical spine, and then we can hold that while performing our little hundreds pulses. Here you'll really feel it's quite challenging to maintain that height of the lower abdominal wall from the floor, and you'll feel yourself starting to bob around, which shows that you're really challenging that core stability element when you perform those hundreds. If all of that is pretty rudimentary for you and you find you can do a good portion of exercise in that position, well, you can move on to the more advanced level of the breaststroke prep, which starts with the hands acting as a head cushion underneath the front of your head here. We still want to make sure our shoulders come back and set, so you'll feel that there's an accompanying elbow slide towards your feet when you set your shoulders. We don't want to be in that bunched up, hunched position, so draw those shoulder blades back. Here, even more attention should be paid to keeping that lower abdominal wall away from the floor, engaging those deep abdominal stabilizers. And take a breath in and breathe out to float up, and then breathe in to lower back down. Your head stays in contact with the top of your hands so that you keep that lovely neutral neck position. Set those shoulders and floating up and down into this slightly more advanced breaststroke prep. That final level is drifting towards more of the advanced aspects of the modified mat work exercise repertoire. So again, all the usual caveats in place for that. If you're going to attempt that final one and practice that kind of dorsal raise movement with the hands up here, there's a lot of leverage at play with the weight of the arms and the upper body, and you need to make sure that the requisite parts of your lumbar pelvic stability and that control of that neutral position are really on point before you move on to that sort of exercise. But hopefully you can see the natural kind of sequential pattern we go through. Again, just to recap, from that shoulder setting, adding in the weight of the arms, bringing in the dorsal raise with the chest and head together for the breaststroke prep, and then, and if the endurance and control, etc. are all fine, we can move on to that last variation, which would set us up very nicely for the classical breaststroke in due course. Anyway, I hope you found that video helpful. Remember, I know I've said it a few times already, but if you do experience any significant tightening or discomfort in your low back, you really need to think about modifying, going back to earlier levels, or the addition of support underneath the stomach when you're performing this, because you don't want to get into a pattern where that's becoming commonplace. It can be very, very counterproductive and set you back if you're not careful. So there's the breaststroke preparation, and good luck with your practice.